Thank you, Chair Holman and Vice Chair Udall, for having this hearing. I've worked to try and improve conditions for Native children pretty much my whole public life, and this scourge of human trafficking is yet another chapter in ongoing challenges. I think it's important that as we're looking at this and thinking about law enforcement, thinking about interventions, that we begin to look at the root causes of what's actually happening here. And so it's important on this committee that we not turn a blind eye to those on the margins, and that we address the root cause that has led many of these victims to be so available and vulnerable in the first place. As you all know, human trafficking of Native Americans is intrinsically linked to historic trauma, to homelessness, poverty, drug and sexual child abuse, and jurisdictional challenges. The latest challenge that we're confronting in Indian country is an incredible expansion of the number of children who are in foster care. We know that foster care children are particularly vulnerable, especially when they run away. Up in Turtle Mountain Reservation in my state, I was recently visiting, and the tribal chairman there told me that just in a couple years, we have increased the foster care population from 150 children, which is outrageous to begin with, to 300. Those are 300 vulnerable children who need our assistance, and we cannot solve this problem by prosecuting alone. We've got to not have law enforcement act, we have to have law enforcement so that these folks cannot act with impunity and think it's open hunting season, but we've got to address the root causes. Fundamentally, poverty and family issues and issues of child sex abuse, drug abuse, and all the things that make our children very, very vulnerable. And so the work of this committee goes beyond on anti-trafficking, goes beyond simply what we're talking about today. Everything that we do to build resilience within Indian country is an anti-trafficking move. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It just start out with the story, and it goes to what Ms. Matthews was talking about. Years ago, my uncle, who ran the community action program, did one of the first return to work for women who had been in pervasive poverty. And, I was a young college student, and I once asked him, what's the one thing that you would change in their life that would prevent them from being single moms, struggling economically? And he said, I would stop sexual abuse of children. Because in his experience working with these women, that was a common factor. And we can't underestimate the trauma and the impact of child sexual assault. We know, looking at the statistics, and Cindy knows this, that very many of these victims, I like to say, it's not like Laura Ingalls Wilder bounding through the prairie and a black cloud swoops her up and gets her into trafficking. That could happen, I'm not discounting that. But traditionally, these are children who've been thrown away, they're in the foster care system, they've already experienced dramatic sexual abuse in their lives, they feel marginalized already, so that makes them more readily victims. And so we've got to go back to the basics, and the basics involve trauma. And I want to thank Senator Franken. He, along with Senator Durbin, Senator Booker, and I have really worked very hard on the issue of trauma and trauma-based treatment. But it is unique to the population of Native Americans because of historic trauma. And I'm glad, Mr. Tulu, you walked some of what we heard back, because I don't think you can treat Native American victims without treating Native American victims culturally. Cindy, I want to go to the work that you're doing right now and that you'll continue to do in building on training, because I think a lot of what we're talking about here, at least in terms of prosecution, but also prevention, involves training. And we know that this has become a fairly popular issue. A lot of people talking about it, which means that people kind of run to where the money is, and we don't have best practices always being exercised, and that really complicates this issue. So can you tell us the things that the McCain Institute is doing now in terms of both training on sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and how we can use your work to better inform federal policy here?
Training is essential. Training and awareness, and I sometimes feel like a broken record on this, but it is the truth. training that is local, as we talked about, trauma-informed, but it has to have a set of principles to it. The same items have to be included in it. So the Institute has put together, we worked with the Attorneys General to put together their working manual on trafficking victims, awareness, et cetera. We have begun some work now on labor trafficking. As you know, we're based in Texas on this one, and we're putting together a prosecutor's manual on how to prosecute traffickers and how to not just prosecute, of course, but how to stop it. More importantly, these kinds of basic tools are almost non-existent around the country. So anything that the federal government can do to not only help organizations or agencies put together a manual that works, that is systemized, that is something that includes the same things for the most part, and then of course tweak it per where region you're in, what state you're in, what you're dealing with. The most important part of this is, in my opinion, is also dealing with the customer. And we can talk all day long about what to do and how to help everybody and all these things, but until we talk openly about men buying children for sex, we're not going to get anywhere. And it's an ugly topic. So that has to be, in my opinion, has to be talked about, certainly in justice and Health and Human Services and other agencies, collectively working together on just this. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. But I think that the work that you're doing is so important because we do need a best practices. Otherwise, we may be spending a lot of money or doing a lot of things that won't have any benefit. Long run, and the same is true in victim services.
You're very true. That's very right.
Right. I think when we get our arms around this problem. Just to tell a story, Dickinson, North Dakota, during the height of the boom, and I think, Cindy, you heard this when you were there, they did a sting where they advertised a 14-year-old. It was pretty clear. Mm-hmm. And just within a couple hours, they had to shut it down because the jail was already full, and they had 2 people calling for 12-year-olds. Mm-hmm. So what does that say? It says that somehow we have normalized this behavior to the point that people we're not getting through, and we cannot normalize this behavior. No. But if we're going to prevent this behavior, we have to look at the conditions, beginning with childhood trauma and the conditions that lead to that trauma, that will build a more resilient population in Indian country to resist all of this. And I want to thank you, Ms. Matthews. I know your great work. All of you are working so hard. We have to make this our top priority.
May I also say the anonymity of the internet is a big player in this. The inability for people to know who's really there, and the freedom of which they can buy a child, and the ease with it. Something has to be done to stop that.